Every message I carried across the Pacific was a lifeline stretched between hope and despair, between boys who might live to see another sunrise, and families back home who would never know if their letters reached the sons they had sent to fight in places they could not even pronounce. My name is Frederick Lawson, and I am 92 years old, one of the last living witnesses to that island-hopping war where death came from the sky and the sea and the jungle, and where a single radio message could mean the difference between salvation and annihilation for thousands of American servicemen scattered across an ocean so vast that it seemed to swallow entire fleets without a trace. If you are listening to this story, please take a moment to comment below and tell me where you're hearing this from, because these memories of the Pacific Theater need to be shared across every corner of our world before men like me are gone forever, and the lessons we learned about communication and courage and the terrible responsibility of carrying other people's hopes are lost to time. And if you or someone you know has served in communications or signal corps, please share a number in the comments. Any number that feels right to you, because sometimes the weight of these memories is lighter when we know we are not carrying them alone across the vast distances that separate us from those we have lost. I was 18 years old in December of 1941, which seems impossible now because 18 felt so young then. Yet I was already training to become a Navy radio man at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and turned what had seemed like a peacetime exercise into preparation for the most brutal war in human history. My buddies called me Freddy back then, and I had this nervous habit of tapping out Morse code on my leg whenever I was thinking, though I wonder now if anyone would recognize the man who came back from those Pacific Islands, because the boy who left Illinois with dreams of adventure died somewhere in the radio shack of a destroyer during a kamikaze attack, and what came home was something else entirely. The journey to that hellish war began weeks after Pearl Harbor, when our communications training was accelerated and intensified in ways that made it clear that the Navy needed radio men desperately, that the coming conflict would be won or lost based on our ability to coordinate operations across thousands of miles of ocean, where a single garbled transmission could doom an entire task force, and where maintaining contact with scattered units would often be the only thing standing between victory and catastrophe. I had always been good with electronics and Morse code, spending hours as a teenager building crystal radios and learning to recognize the distinctive rhythm of different operators. But nothing had prepared me for the responsibility of handling communications that would determine whether men lived or died. The other boys in my radio training class were Robert Chun from California, 19 years old, with these incredibly quick fingers that could send Morse code faster than anyone I had ever seen, and William Murphy from New York, 18 years old, with a photographic memory that allowed him to remember call signs and frequencies without writing them down, and James Rodriguez from Texas, 20 years old and already married with a baby daughter he had never met, who could repair any radio equipment with nothing more than a screwdriver and determination. And finally there was Chief Petty Officer Samuel Harrison, 32 years old and a veteran of the pre-war Navy, who had already served on destroyers in the Atlantic and knew what real combat communications were like when everything was falling apart and the only thing connecting you to the rest of the world was a voice crackling through static. But what I remember most about those final weeks of training was not the technical instruction or the equipment familiarization or the endless practice sessions where we learned to send and receive messages under simulated combat conditions, but rather the way Chief Harrison would look at us sometimes. These young men who were about to be scattered across the Pacific to serve on ships and in radio stations where they would be responsible for maintaining the communication networks that held the entire war effort together. And I could see in his eyes that he understood something about what we were going to face that we could not yet comprehend. My first assignment was to the USS Porter, a destroyer that was part of Task Force 16 under Admiral William Halsey, and I reported aboard in San Francisco in March of 1942, carrying my sea bag and my radio operator's manual, and this terrible excitement about finally getting to participate in the war that everyone said would determine the future of civilization. The Porter was a beautiful ship, sleek and fast, and bristling with weapons, and I felt proud to be part of her crew, but I had no idea that I was about to spend the next 3 years in a floating steel box that would be attacked by submarines and aircraft and surface ships, where every day would bring new messages about death and destruction, and where my job would be to maintain contact with the outside world, even when that world seemed determined to destroy us. The radio shack on the Porter was a cramped compartment filled with equipment that hummed and crackled and glowed with vacuum tubes, and it was here that I would spend most of my waking hours for the next 3 years, hunched over transmitters and receivers, copying messages in Morse code and voice, maintaining the communication schedules that connected our ship to the rest of the fleet, and handling the personal messages that sailors sent home to families who seemed impossibly distant across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. My first real combat came during the Doolittle raid in April of 1942, when our task force escorted the aircraft carrier Hornet to within striking distance of Japan, and I was responsible for maintaining radio silence while we approached the enemy coast, knowing that a single transmission could alert Japanese forces to our presence and doom the entire mission. For 16 hours, I sat in that radio shack listening to the static and the distant voices of other ships, fighting the urge to respond to routine calls, knowing that the success of the mission and the lives of everyone aboard depended on our ability to remain invisible to enemy radio direction finders. When the B-25 bombers finally launched from the Hornet's deck, I was the one who transmitted the coded message to Pearl Harbor that told Admiral Nimitz the raid was underway, and for a few minutes I felt like I was at the center of history, that my fingers on the Morse key were helping to strike back at the enemy who had attacked our country. But that feeling of importance quickly faded when I realized that those bombers were flying into almost certain death, and that my message might be the last communication anyone would ever receive from Colonel Doolittle and his aircrews. The months that followed were a blur of training exercises and convoy duty and patrol missions, as the Navy struggled to rebuild after Pearl Harbor and prepare for the massive offensive operations that everyone knew were coming. I became expert at copying messages in heavy weather and during combat maneuvers, when the ship was rolling and pitching so violently that it was almost impossible to maintain contact with other vessels, and I learned to recognize the distinctive transmission characteristics of dozens of different radio operators, developing an almost supernatural ability to identify friendly voices through the static and interference that plagued long-distance communications in the Pacific. But it was during the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942 that I truly understood what my job meant, when our task force engaged a Japanese fleet in the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, and I spent 3 days copying damage reports and casualty lists and requests for assistance from ships that were being bombed and torpedoed hundreds of miles away. The messages came in fragments, interrupted by enemy jamming and atmospheric interference, and I had to piece together a picture of the battle from incomplete transmissions that often cut off in mid-sentence when the sender was killed or his equipment was destroyed. I remember one message from the aircraft carrier Lexington, sent by a radio man whose voice I had been hearing for weeks during routine communications, and he was reporting that his ship had been hit by multiple torpedoes and was listing badly, and then there was a pause, and when he came back on the air, his voice was different, higher and more strained, and he said that the engine room was flooding and they were losing power, and then the transmission just stopped, and despite my attempts to re-establish contact, I never heard from that radio man again. Later, I learned that the Lexington had been abandoned and scuttled, and that many of her crew had been killed or wounded, and I realized that the voice I had been listening to belonged to a young man not much older than myself, who had died while trying to do his job, trying to keep his ship connected to the rest of the fleet even as it was sinking beneath him. And that dedication to duty in the face of death became a standard that I tried to live up to for the rest of the war. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 was even worse, because I was responsible for relaying intelligence reports about Japanese fleet movements, and every message I transmitted was based on information gathered by code breakers who had risked their lives to penetrate enemy communications, and I knew that any mistake in transmission could result in American forces being surprised and destroyed by superior enemy numbers. For 4 days I barely slept, copying and retransmitting messages about enemy positions and intentions, coordinates for airstrikes and warnings about submarine attacks, all while our ship maneuvered at high speed to avoid detection by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The most important message I ever transmitted was the one that told Admiral Spruance the exact position of the Japanese carrier fleet on the morning of June 4th, information that allowed our dive bombers to find and destroy 4 enemy aircraft carriers in a single day, turning the tide of the Pacific War in America's favor. I sent that message in Morse code, tapping out the coordinates with my right hand while copying incoming traffic with my left, and for a few seconds I held in my fingers the information that would determine whether America won or lost the war in the Pacific. But with that importance came a terrible responsibility, because I knew that if I made a mistake, if I transposed a single number or letter, American pilots would fly into empty ocean, while Japanese carriers escaped to fight another day, and thousands of sailors and Marines would die in future battles that could have been prevented. That weight of responsibility never left me, not during the war, and not in the 70 years since, because I learned that in modern warfare, information is as deadly as any weapon, and the people who handle that information carry the lives of their comrades in their hands every time they touch a transmitter key. After Midway, the porter was assigned to support the invasion of Guadalcanal, and I found myself responsible for maintaining communications between the landing force and the supporting fleet, relaying requests for naval gunfire support and airstrikes, and handling the constant stream of casualty reports and supply requests that flowed back from the beaches where Marines were fighting and dying in conditions that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The worst part was the personal messages, the letters from home that sailors and Marines had asked me to transmit to their families, often written in foxholes or hospital beds, sometimes dictated to me by men who were too wounded to write, but who desperately wanted to send word home that they were still alive. I became a conduit for love and fear and hope, carrying the voices of men who might not survive the next battle to families who were counting the days until their sons and husbands and brothers came home. One message I will never forget came from a Marine corporal named David Thompson, 21 years old, from Oregon, who had been wounded during the fighting for Henderson Field and was being evacuated to a hospital ship. He asked me to send a message to his wife, telling her that he loved her and that he was sorry he would not be home for the birth of their first child. And as I tapped out his words in Morse code, I could hear him crying softly in the background, and I knew that I was transmitting not just information, but human emotion across thousands of miles of ocean. Another message came from a Navy pilot named Lieutenant Robert Kim, 23 years old, from Hawaii, whose aircraft had been shot down during a raid on Japanese positions, and he was floating in a life raft somewhere in the Solomon Sea, using a portable radio to send distress signals that I picked up during a routine communication watch. For 6 hours, I maintained contact with Lieutenant Kim, relaying his position to search and rescue aircraft, listening as his voice grew weaker and more desperate, until finally his radio went silent and I never heard from him again. The search planes never found Lieutenant Kim or his life raft, and he was officially listed as missing in action. But I knew that somewhere in the vast Pacific Ocean, a young man had died alone, while I listened helplessly, unable to do anything except pass along his final words to people who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to him. That sense of helplessness, of being connected to tragedy but unable to prevent it, became a constant companion during my years in the Pacific, where I was often the last person to hear from men who were about to die. The Solomon Islands campaign lasted for months, and during that time I handled hundreds of messages from units scattered across dozens of islands, each one representing human lives hanging in the balance. I relayed requests for medical supplies to field hospitals that were running out of morphine and bandages, transmitted coordinates for supply drops to Marine units that had been cut off by Japanese counterattacks, and maintained contact with coast watchers who were hiding behind enemy lines, providing intelligence about Japanese ship and aircraft movements. One of those coast watchers was an Australian named Captain James Wilson, 35 years old and a veteran of the First World War, who was operating from a concealed radio station on Bougainville Island, deep in Japanese-controlled territory. For weeks, I was his only contact with the outside world, receiving his reports about enemy activities and relaying messages between him and his superiors in Australia. And I began to feel a personal connection to this man I had never met, but whose voice had become as familiar as that of my own family. Captain Wilson's reports were incredibly valuable, providing advance warning of Japanese air raids and naval movements, and his information saved countless American lives by allowing our forces to prepare for enemy attacks or avoid walking into ambushes. But maintaining contact with him was extremely dangerous, because Japanese direction-finding equipment was constantly searching for his transmissions, and every message he sent increased the risk that he would be discovered and killed. The end came in October of 1942, when Captain Wilson sent a message reporting that Japanese forces were closing in on his position and that he was destroying his radio equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. His final transmission was a personal message to his wife in Sydney, asking me to tell her that he loved her and that he was proud to have served with the American forces in the Pacific, and then his radio went silent forever. I later learned that Captain Wilson had been captured by Japanese forces and executed as a spy, and that his sacrifice had contributed significantly to the American victory in the Solomon Islands. But at the time, all I knew was that another voice had disappeared from the airwaves. Another connection to the human cost of the war had been severed, and I was left with the responsibility of carrying his final words to people who would mourn his loss for the rest of their lives. By the end of 1942, I had been promoted to radioman first class, and I was assigned to the newly commissioned destroyer USS O'Brien, which was designed to carry the latest communication equipment and serve as a flagship for destroyer squadrons operating in the forward areas of the Pacific. The O'Brien was faster and more heavily armed than the Porter, but she was also a target for every Japanese submarine and aircraft in the area, because enemy forces had learned that destroyers with sophisticated radio equipment were often carrying important personnel or serving as communication hubs for major operations. My new radio shap was larger and more advanced than the one on the Porter, with multiple transmitters and receivers that allowed me to maintain contact with dozens of different units simultaneously. But the increased capability also meant increased responsibility, because I was now handling communications for entire task groups rather than just individual ships, and the volume of traffic was sometimes overwhelming. The invasion of the Marshall Islands in early 1944 was my first major operation as senior radioman on the O'Brien, and I was responsible for coordinating communications between the landing force, the supporting fleet, and headquarters in Pearl Harbor, all while maintaining the routine schedules that kept scattered units in contact with each other across thousands of miles of ocean. For 3 weeks, I worked 18-hour days, copying and transmitting messages that ranged from strategic intelligence to requests for toilet paper, each one equally important to the people who depended on reliable communications. During the Marshall Islands operation, I handled my first messages from prisoners of war, American servicemen who had been captured by Japanese forces and were being held in camps scattered across the Pacific. These messages were heartbreaking because they were often the first word that families had received from loved ones who had been missing for months or years, and they were usually brief and heavily censored, providing just enough information to confirm that the sender was still alive, but not enough to satisfy the desperate hunger for news that consumed the families of missing servicemen. One such message came from Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, 24 years old, from California, who had been captured during the fall of the Philippines and was being held at a prison camp in Japan. His message was addressed to his parents in San Francisco, and it contained only basic information about his health and location. But I could tell from the formal language and stilted phrasing that it had been written under Japanese supervision, and I wondered what he had really wanted to say to his family, but had been forbidden to include. Another message came from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Murphy, 32 years old, and a career Army officer who had been captured on Bataan and was now in a prison camp in Korea. His message was even more formal and impersonal than Sergeant Chun's, containing only the minimum information required by the Geneva Convention. But between the lines, I could sense the desperation of a man who was trying to let his wife know that he was still alive while being careful not to say anything that might result in punishment by his captors. These prisoner of war messages were among the most difficult I ever handled, not because they were technically challenging, but because they represented human suffering on a scale that was almost incomprehensible, and because I knew that for every message I transmitted, there were probably dozens of other prisoners who were not allowed to communicate with their families, men who had simply vanished into the Japanese prison system and whose fate would remain unknown until the end of the war. The invasion of Saipan in June of 1944 brought a new level of intensity to Pacific communications, because the island was heavily fortified and defended by experienced Japanese troops who were determined to fight to the death rather than surrender. For 6 weeks, I maintained contact with Marine and Army units that were advancing yard by yard across terrain that had been turned into a fortress. And every message I received told the story of incredible courage and terrible casualties. The most disturbing messages came from the forward aid stations, where Navy corpsmen and Army medics were treating wounded Marines and soldiers under conditions that challenged every principle of medical care. These men were working without adequate supplies or facilities, performing surgery by flashlight in shell holes and caves, trying to save lives while under constant enemy fire, and their requests for medical supplies and evacuation support painted a picture of suffering that haunted my dreams for decades after the war. One message I will never forget came from Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Wilson, 22 years old, from Missouri, who was working at an aid station that had been set up in a former Japanese bunker. His message was a request for morphine and plasma, basic medical supplies that were desperately needed to treat Marines who had been wounded during the latest assault on Japanese positions. But the message was interrupted by the sound of incoming artillery, and when the transmission resumed, Corpsman Wilson reported that the aid station had taken a direct hit and that several wounded Marines had been killed. The final part of his message was a list of casualties, names and service numbers of men who had died while receiving medical treatment, and I realized that I was copying the death notices of Marines who had survived combat wounds only to be killed by enemy fire while lying helpless on stretchers. That message crystallized for me the random cruelty of war, the way that death could strike anywhere and anyone, regardless of rank or responsibility or previous service. And I began to understand that survival in combat was largely a matter of luck rather than skill or courage. Another message from Saipan came from Major Robert Kim, 28 years old, and a Marine Corps officer who was leading an infantry battalion in the attack on Japanese positions near Garapan. His message was a situation report describing the progress of the assault and the condition of his unit. But embedded in the formal military language was a story of incredible heroism and sacrifice, as Marines advanced across open ground under heavy enemy fire, taking casualties, but continuing to move forward because stopping meant death for everyone. Major Kim's final message came 3 days later, transmitted by his radio operator because the major himself had been killed by a Japanese sniper while leading an assault on an enemy strongpoint. The radio operator, a corporal whose name I never learnt, sent a brief report describing Major Kim's death and requesting instructions about who should take command of the battalion, and I could hear in his voice the exhaustion and grief of a young man who had watched his commanding officer die and now had to continue the mission without leadership or guidance. The battle for Saipan lasted for 3 weeks, and during that time I transmitted hundreds of messages that documented the human cost of amphibious warfare against a determined and well-entrenched enemy. The casualty reports were staggering, with entire companies reduced to squad strength and battalions that had started with 800 men finishing the battle, with fewer than 200 effective fighters. And I began to understand that the Pacific War was not just a conflict between nations, but a grinding war of attrition that was consuming an entire generation of young Americans. But the worst messages were the personal ones, the letters that wounded Marines and soldiers dictated to corpsmen and chaplains, final words to families back home from men who knew they were dying and wanted to say goodbye. These messages were heartbreaking because they were so ordinary, filled with expressions of love and regret and hope for the future, written by young men who would never have the chance to fulfill the promises they were making to wives and children, and parents who would spend the rest of their lives treasuring these final communications. One such message came from Private First Class David Rodriguez, 19 years old, from Texas, who had been wounded by Japanese mortar fire and was dying in a field hospital on Saipan. His message was addressed to his mother, and it was dictated to a Navy chaplain, who transmitted it to me for relay to the United States. Private Rodriguez wanted his mother to know that he was not afraid, that he was proud to have served his country, and that he hoped his younger brother would not have to fight in the war. And as I copied his words, I could hear the chaplain's voice breaking with emotion as he read the young Marine's final thoughts. Another message came from Sergeant Michael Thompson, 23 years old, from Michigan, who had lost both legs to a Japanese landmine and was being evacuated to a hospital ship. His message was to his wife, telling her about their unborn child and asking her to name the baby after his father if it was a boy, and to teach the child about the importance of freedom and democracy and the sacrifices that had been made to preserve them. And I realized that I was transmitting not just personal communications, but a statement of faith in the values that American servicemen were fighting and dying to defend. The invasion of the Philippines in October of 1944 marked the beginning of the most intense period of communications activity I experienced during the war, because General MacArthur's return to the islands involved coordinating multiple amphibious assaults across hundreds of miles of ocean, with Army, Navy, and Marine Corps units operating simultaneously against Japanese forces that were determined to hold their positions at any cost. For 6 months, I worked around the clock, maintaining contact with units scattered across dozens of islands, relaying intelligence reports and operational orders, and a constant stream of casualty notifications that marked the progress of the campaign. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in history, and I was responsible for maintaining communications between the various American task forces that were converging on the Japanese fleet from multiple directions. For 4 days, I copied and transmitted messages that described running battles between aircraft carriers and battleships, submarine attacks and air raids, all while our own ship maneuvered at high speed to avoid enemy torpedoes and bombs. The most dramatic message I handled during Leyte Gulf came from the aircraft carrier USS Gambier Bay, which was under attack by Japanese battleships and cruisers that had broken through the American screening forces. The message was sent by the ship's radio operator, a young sailor whose voice I had been hearing for months during routine communications, and he was reporting that his ship was taking heavy damage and might have to be abandoned, but that the crew was continuing to fight and launch aircraft despite the hopeless odds they faced. The Gambier Bay's final message was a brief transmission reporting that the ship was sinking and that the crew was abandoning ship, and then the radio went silent, and despite repeated attempts to re-establish contact, I never heard from that aircraft carrier again. Later, I learned that the Gambier Bay had been sunk with heavy loss of life, and that many of her crew had died while trying to save their ship and protect the other vessels in the task force. And I realized that the voice I had been listening to belonged to a radio man who had stayed at his post until the very end, transmitting information that might help other ships survive, even as his own ship was going down. The Philippines campaign produced some of the most disturbing communications I handled during the war, because the fighting was so brutal and the conditions were so terrible that even routine messages contained descriptions of suffering that would haunt anyone who read them. The Japanese defenders were fighting with a fanaticism that bordered on madness, using suicide attacks and booby traps and deliberate atrocities against prisoners and civilians. and the American response was equally ruthless, because mercy was a luxury that few units could afford when facing an enemy that showed no quarter. One message that particularly disturbed me came from a Marine Corps intelligence officer who was interrogating Japanese prisoners captured during the fighting on Luzon. The message contained information about Japanese defensive positions and troop strengths, valuable intelligence that would help American forces plan their attacks. But it also included descriptions of the methods being used to extract this information, techniques that would probably be considered torture under normal circumstances, but that were being justified by the extreme conditions of combat in the Pacific. Another message came from an army chaplain who was working with Filipino civilians who had been liberated from Japanese occupation, and his report described atrocities that Japanese forces had committed against the local population, including mass executions and systematic rape and torture of anyone suspected of supporting American forces. The chaplain's message was a request for medical supplies and food for the civilian refugees, but it was also a documentation of war crimes that would need to be investigated and prosecuted after the conflict ended. These messages forced me to confront the reality that war brings out both the best and worst in human nature, that the same conflict that produced incredible acts of heroism and self-sacrifice also created conditions where ordinary people became capable of unspeakable cruelty, and that the communication networks I was helping to maintain were carrying information about both the nobility and the degradation of the human spirit under extreme stress. The final phase of the Pacific War began with the invasion of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, and I was assigned to support the communications for this operation from the command ship USS El Dorado, which served as Admiral Turner's headquarters for the amphibious assault. Iwo Jima was supposed to be a quick operation, a stepping stone to the invasion of Japan itself, but it turned into 5 weeks of the most intense fighting in Marine Corps history, and I spent those weeks copying messages that documented courage and sacrifice on a scale that seemed almost superhuman. The messages from Iwo Jima were different from those I had handled during previous operations, because the fighting was so close and so personal that formal military language seemed inadequate to describe what was happening on the island. Marine units were advancing yard by yard against Japanese positions that had been carved into the volcanic rock, fighting hand-to-hand in tunnels and caves, dying in numbers that seemed impossible to sustain, yet continuing to attack because stopping meant death for everyone involved. One message that exemplified the spirit of Iwo Jima came from Colonel Johnson, 42 years old and a career Marine officer who was commanding a regiment that had been reduced to company strength after 3 weeks of fighting. His message was a situation report describing his unit's position and casualties, but it also contained a request to continue the attack despite the fact that his men were exhausted and running low on ammunition, because he believed that one more assault might break Japanese resistance in his sector. Colonel Johnson's next message came 6 hours later, transmitted by his radio operator because the colonel himself had been killed while leading that final assault. The radio operator reported that the attack had succeeded, that the Japanese positions had been overrun, and that the regiment was consolidating its gains. But he also reported that Colonel Johnson had died while personally leading the charge against an enemy machine gun nest, and that his last words had been instructions to continue the mission and take care of his men. Another message from Iwo Jima came from a Navy corpsman named Petty Officer 3rd Class Robert Churn, 20 years old, from California, who was working at an aid station that had been set up in a former Japanese bunker. His message was a request for medical supplies and evacuation support for wounded Marines, but it also contained a description of the conditions under which he was working, treating men who had been wounded by flamethrowers and explosive charges, performing surgery without adequate anesthesia or sterile equipment, watching young Marines die from wounds that would have been treatable under normal circumstances. Petty Officer Chan's final message came during the last week of fighting, when Japanese forces launched a final desperate counterattack against American positions near the northern end of the island. His message reported that the aid station had been overrun by Japanese soldiers and that several wounded Marines had been killed while lying helpless on stretchers, but that he and the other corpsmen were continuing to treat casualties despite the fact that they were now behind enemy lines and facing almost certain death or capture. The search for Petty Officer Chern and the other missing corpsmen continued for several days after the official end of the battle, but their bodies were never found, and they were officially listed as missing in action. I never learned what happened to them, but I suspect that they died while trying to save the lives of wounded Marines, maintaining their medical duties even in the face of overwhelming enemy force. And their sacrifice became for me a symbol of the dedication and professionalism that characterized American military personnel throughout the Pacific War. The invasion of Okinawa in April of 1945 was the final major operation I supported during the war, and it was also the most challenging from a communications standpoint, because the island was heavily defended and the fighting lasted for 3 months, requiring me to maintain contact with units scattered across a larger area and for a longer period than any previous operation. The messages from Okinawa told the story of the bloodiest campaign in Pacific War history, with casualties on both sides reaching levels that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the conflict. But the most significant aspect of the Okinawa campaign, from my perspective as a communications specialist, was the introduction of kamikaze attacks on a massive scale, with hundreds of Japanese aircraft deliberately crashing into American ships in an attempt to destroy the invasion fleet through sheer force of sacrifice. These suicide attacks created a new category of emergency communications, as ships that had been hit by kamikazes transmitted damage reports and requests for assistance, often from radio operators who were themselves wounded or dying. The most dramatic kamikaze message I handled came from the destroyer USS Laffey, which was attacked by 22 Japanese aircraft in the space of 80 minutes and managed to survive despite taking multiple hits from bombs and crashing planes. The ship's radio operator, a young sailor whose voice remained calm despite the chaos around him, transmitted a running commentary on the attack, describing each kamikaze as it approached and reporting the damage as bombs exploded and aircraft crashed into his ship. The Laffey's radio operator continued transmitting even after his radio equipment had been damaged by bomb fragments and his radio shack had been flooded by water from broken fire mains. Rigging emergency antennas and using portable equipment to maintain contact with other ships in the task force. His professionalism under the most extreme circumstances became legendary among Pacific communications personnel, and his example inspired me to maintain my own standards of performance, even when conditions seemed hopeless. Another kamikaze message came from the aircraft carrier USS Franklin, which was hit by 2 Japanese bombs that penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar spaces, causing massive fires and explosions that killed hundreds of her crew. The ship's communications were initially knocked out by the attack, but within an hour, surviving radio operators had rigged emergency equipment and were transmitting damage reports and requests for assistance, coordinating the rescue operations that eventually saved the ship and most of her crew. The Franklin's radio operators worked for 12 hours straight, transmitting messages while fires raged around them and secondary explosions shook the ship, maintaining contact with rescue vessels and providing the information that allowed damage control parties to focus their efforts where they were most needed. Several of these radio operators were killed or wounded while performing their duties, but others took their places, ensuring that communications were never completely interrupted, even under the most desperate circumstances. These kamikaze attacks forced me to confront the reality that war was no longer bound by rational calculations of cost and benefit, that the Japanese were willing to sacrifice everything in an attempt to prevent American victory, and that the Pacific War had become a conflict where survival depended not just on superior equipment and tactics, but also on the willingness to match enemy fanaticism with American determination and professionalism. The war ended abruptly in August of 1945, after the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan, and I was responsible for transmitting some of the first messages about Japanese surrender negotiations, communications that would end the most destructive conflict in human history and begin the process of rebuilding a world that had been shattered by 6 years of total war. The Japanese surrender message was transmitted on August 15, 1945, and I was one of the radio operators who copied the official announcement of Emperor Hirohito's decision to end the war, a message that reached American forces throughout the Pacific simultaneously and brought an immediate end to combat operations that had been planned to continue for months or even years. But the end of the war also brought new responsibilities, as I became involved in handling communications for the repatriation of American prisoners of war and the occupation of Japan, operations that required the same level of precision and dedication that had characterized wartime communications, but with the added complexity of coordinating between former enemies who were now working together to establish peace. The prisoner of war repatriation messages were among the most emotionally challenging I ever handled, because they involved American servicemen who had been held captive for years under conditions that had broken, many of them physically and psychologically, and their return to American control required careful coordination between military and medical personnel who were trying to assess their condition and provide appropriate treatment. One such message came from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Murphy, the same officer whose prisoner of war message I had transmitted years earlier, and who was now being liberated from a prison camp in Korea. His repatriation message was addressed to his wife, informing her that he was alive and would be coming home. But the formal language and emotional restraint of the message suggested that his years in captivity had changed him in ways that would take time to understand and address. Another repatriation message came from Staff Sergeant Michael Chun, who had survived his imprisonment in Japan and was being evacuated to a military hospital in the Philippines for medical evaluation and treatment. His message to his parents was more personal than his earlier prisoner of war communication, but it still contained hints of the trauma he had experienced, references to friends who had not survived captivity, and medical problems that would require ongoing treatment. These repatriation messages made me realize that the end of the war did not mean the end of suffering for the people who had fought it, that many American servicemen would carry physical and psychological wounds for the rest of their lives, and that the communication networks I had helped to maintain during the war would now be used to help these men reconnect with families and communities that had been forever changed by their absence. I came home to Illinois in October of 1945, carrying my discharge papers and my Navy service records, and this incredible knowledge of what happens to human civilization when nations decide to settle their differences through industrial warfare. And my family was waiting for me at the train station, looking exactly the way I had remembered them during all those years in the Pacific. But I found that I could not immediately return to the civilian world I had left, because something inside me had been permanently altered by exposure to the communication networks that held together the largest military operation in human history. I married my childhood sweetheart Margaret in December of 1945, and I tried to build a normal civilian life, working for the telephone company and raising 3 children. But there were times when I would find myself listening to radio communications, monitoring emergency frequencies and amateur radio networks, as if I was still responsible for maintaining contact with scattered units across vast distances, and Margaret would find me in my basement radio room at 2 in the morning, copying Morse code transmissions from stations around the world. The skills I had learned as a Navy radioman served me well in civilian employment, and I eventually became a supervisor for the telephone company's long-distance operations, responsible for maintaining communication networks that connected millions of people across the United States. But the responsibility never felt as urgent or as important as it had during the war, when a single message could determine whether men lived or died. For decades after the war, I continued to receive letters from families of servicemen I had known in the Pacific, people who wanted to thank me for transmitting their loved ones' final messages, or who were seeking additional information about what had happened to sons and husbands and brothers who had never come home. These letters reminded me that my wartime service had connected me to thousands of people I had never met, families whose lives had been forever changed by the messages I had carried across the Pacific. One such letter came from the widow of Major Robert Kim, the Marine officer who had been killed on Saipan, and she wanted to know if I remembered anything about her husband's final communications, any personal details that might help her understand what he had been thinking during his last days. I was able to tell her about the professionalism and dedication her husband had shown, how his messages had always put the welfare of his men ahead of his own safety, and how his final transmission had been a situation report that helped other units avoid the ambush that had killed him. Another letter came from the parents of Petty Officer Robert Churn, the Navy corpsman who had disappeared during the fighting on Iwo Jima, and they were hoping that I might have additional information about what had happened to their son during his final weeks. I was able to share some of the messages he had transmitted, descriptions of his medical work under combat conditions, and his dedication to treating wounded Marines despite the extreme dangers he faced, and I hoped that these details would help his parents understand that their son had died while serving others. These correspondence relationships with the families of men I had known during the war became one of the most meaningful aspects of my post-war life, a way of honoring the memory of people who had made the ultimate sacrifice, while also helping their loved ones find some measure of peace and understanding. I realized that my role as a communications specialist had given me a unique perspective on the human cost of war, because I had been connected to so many individual stories of courage and sacrifice, and that this perspective carried with it a responsibility to bear witness to what I had experienced. And now, at 92 years old, I find myself one of the last living veterans of Pacific communications operations, one of the few people left who can remember what it was like to maintain contact with scattered units across thousands of miles of hostile ocean, handling messages that ranged from strategic intelligence to personal communications, each one representing human lives and human emotions that spanned the vast distances between war and home. The technology has changed dramatically since my wartime service, with satellites and computers and digital networks that can transmit information instantaneously around the world. But the fundamental importance of communication in military operations remains the same, and I hope that modern communications personnel understand the responsibility they carry when they handle messages that might determine whether people live or die. Sometimes I still dream about those Pacific radio frequencies, the crackling static and distant voices that connected American forces across an ocean so vast that it seemed to swallow entire fleets. And in those dreams, I am still 18 years old, sitting in a radio shack aboard a destroyer, copying messages that carry the hopes and fears of men who are fighting and dying far from home. And I wake up with the sound of Morse code still echoing in my ears and the weight of all those messages still pressing on my heart. If you have listened to this entire story, I hope you will remember that modern military communications represent one of the most critical aspects of national defense, that the people who maintain these networks carry a responsibility that extends far beyond their technical duties, and that every message they handle might be the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, between hope and despair, for someone who is counting on them to maintain that vital connection between the battlefield and home. And I hope you will also remember that behind every military communication is a human story, that the voices crackling through static and interference represent real people with families and dreams and fears, and that the responsibility of carrying their messages is both an honor and a burden that should never be taken lightly. Because in war, communication is not just about transmitting information, but about maintaining the human connections that make survival worthwhile. The frequencies are silent now, at least for me, but I can still hear those voices from across the Pacific, still feel the weight of all those messages I carried between hope and despair, and I know that as long as I live, I will be connected to every man whose words I transmitted, every family whose loved one I helped to contact, every unit that depended on me to maintain their lifeline to the world beyond the battlefield, because once you become part of the communication network that holds together a military operation, you remain connected forever to everyone whose voice you have carried across the vast distances that separate war from peace.